The cabin of Horizon Air Flight 725 buzzed with the quiet chaos of boarding, a symphony of rustling bags, muffled conversations, and the occasional creak of overhead bins. The air was stale, tinged with that faint airplane smell of recycled oxygen and anticipation. 12-year-old Ethan Clark stood in the narrow aisle of economy class, his small frame dwarfed by the adults shuffling past him. His sneakers scuffed against the worn carpet, and his backpack hung loosely over one shoulder, its straps frayed from years of use. In his hand he clutched a crumpled boarding pass, the ink slightly smudged from the nervous sweat of his palms. His dark brown eyes, wide, curious, and tinged with a quiet vulnerability, darted toward a seat a few rows ahead, an empty window seat, bathed in the soft glow of sunlight streaming through the porthole. To Ethan, it wasn't just a seat, it was a promise. A chance to press his forehead against the cool glass, to watch the world shrink below him until it felt like nothing could touch him. Not the loneliness of flying alone, not the weight of being a kid in a world that so often overlooked him. He'd always loved the window. Ever since his first flight, when he was barely 5, he'd sit there, nose smushed against the glass, tracing the shapes of clouds with his finger, as his mom, Victoria Clark, whispered stories about the places they'd visit someday. Those trips were different, cozy first-class affairs where the flight attendants smiled at him and slipped him extra cookies. But this time was different. This time, Victoria was up in first class, working through emails and preparing for a meeting, while Ethan sat back here in economy, surrounded by strangers who didn't even glance his way. His assigned seat was a middle one, squeezed between a heavy-set man who'd already started snoring and a woman with her nose buried in a thick paperback, her elbow jabbing into his side every time she turned a page. Ethan's heart sank the moment he saw it. No window, no escape, just a long, suffocating flight trapped in the middle. He shifted his weight, glancing at that empty window seat again. No one had claimed it. The aisle seat next to it was occupied by a man in a wrinkled shirt, flipping through a golf magazine, oblivious to the treasure beside him. Ethan's chest tightened with a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could ask. His mom had always taught him to be polite, to use his manners, to trust that kindness would find a way. So he took a deep breath, squared his narrow shoulders, and turned toward the flight attendant, standing a few feet away. Her name tag read El Martinez. She was tall, her uniform pressed to perfection, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun that seemed to match the severity of her expression. She stood like a sentinel, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning the cabin, as if every passenger was a potential rule breaker. "Excuse me, ma'am," Ethan said, his voice soft but steady, the way he'd practiced when he wanted to sound grown up. "Could I move to that window seat over there? It's empty." He pointed, his finger trembling slightly, but his eyes shone with a quiet, earnest hope. El Martinez turned her head slowly, her gaze landing on him like a spotlight. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just stared, her lips pursed, her brow creasing as if his question had somehow offended her. Ethan's stomach twisted, but he held his ground, waiting. "No," she said finally, her voice sharp and cold, slicing through the hum of the cabin. "You need to stay in your assigned seat." The words hit Ethan like a gust of icy wind, knocking the air from his lungs. He blinked, confused. "But no one's sitting there." He tried again, softer this time, his voice cracking at the edges. He wasn't arguing. He was pleading, a boy who just wanted a small piece of comfort on a long flight. El Martinez's eyes narrowed, her posture stiffening. "I said no," she snapped, louder now, her tone dripping with authority. "Sit down, or I'll have to call security." The threat landed like a thunderclap. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his small hands clenching around the boarding pass until it crumpled further. Security? For what? He hadn't yelled, hadn't demanded, hadn't even raised his voice. All he'd done was ask, politely, the way his mom taught him. But now, under El Martinez's glare, he felt like a criminal, like he'd committed some terrible offense just by wanting something simple. His cheeks burned with embarrassment, and his eyes stung with the hot prickle of tears he refused to let fall. Around him, the cabin seemed to shift, A few passengers looked up, their faces flickering with unease. The man in the gray suit, a row ahead, Mr. Bennett, a tired businessman with a briefcase tucked under his seat, lowered his newspaper and frowned. "Doesn't seem like a big deal to me," he muttered, his voice gruff but kind. "Kid just wants to see out the window. What's the harm?" Martinez didn't even glance at him. She turned away, her heels clicking against the floor, her clipboard clutched like a shield. To her, Ethan wasn't a kid with a dream. He was a disruption, a challenge to her control. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, frozen in the aisle, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He felt small, smaller than he'd ever felt before. His shoulders slumped, and he shuffled back to his seat, sinking into the middle spot between the snoring man and the book-reading woman. He stuffed his backpack under the seat in front of him, his movements slow, defeated. The tears he'd fought so hard to hold back welled up again, blurring his vision. He wiped at them with the sleeve of his hoodie, hoping no one would notice. But someone did. Across the aisle, Mr. Bennett watched him, his weathered face softening with something like pity. "That was uncalled for," he said under his breath, shaking his head. "She didn't have to talk to you like that, son." Ethan gave a small shrug, trying to brush it off, but inside, his chest ached. He'd been on flights before, dozens of them, and never had anyone treated him like this. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. He didn't want to bother his mom. She was busy, always busy, but the sting of El Martinez's words wouldn't let go. Finally, he typed a message. "Mom, I asked to switch to a window seat. The flight attendant said no and got really mad. She said she'd call security if I didn't sit down." He hesitated, then added, "I didn't mean to cause trouble." He hit send and set the phone on his lap, his heart pounding. Maybe she wouldn't see it until they landed. Maybe she'd just tell him to let it go. But up in first class, Victoria Clark's phone buzzed against the polished tray table. She glanced at the screen, her calm, composed expression faltering as she read her son's words. Security? Over a window seat. Her jaw tightened, a storm brewing behind her dark eyes. Victoria wasn't just any mother. She was the CEO of Skyjet Airlines, a woman who'd clawed her way to the top through grit, determination, and a fierce love for her son. She'd built this company from nothing, fought off skeptics and competitors, all while raising Ethan to be kind, respectful, and brave. And now, someone under her own employ had threatened him, her boy, for daring to ask for something so small, so innocent. Her fingers tightened around the phone, but her face remained a mask of control. She wasn't the type to explode, to storm through the plane in a blaze of fury. No. Victoria's strength was quieter, sharper, a force that moved mountains without ever raising her voice. She tapped out a reply. "What's the flight number, sweetheart?" Ethan checked his boarding pass and sent it back, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't know what she'd do, but he trusted her. He always had. Victoria leaned back in her seat, her manicured fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. The flight attendant serving first class, Miss Avery, approached with a tray of water, her smile warm and practiced. "Everything all right, ma'am?" she asked, tilting her head as she noticed the subtle shift in Victoria's demeanor. Something in the way her eyes hardened, the way her lips pressed into a thin line. Victoria looked up, her voice low but laced with steel. "I need to speak with the captain," she said. Miss Avery blinked, caught off guard. "The captain, ma'am?" she echoed, her smile faltering. Victoria nodded once, her gaze unwavering. "Yes, there's something happening on this flight that he needs to know about immediately." Her words were measured, deliberate, but they carried the weight of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, a mother protecting her child, a CEO reclaiming her authority. Miss Avery hesitated for only a heartbeat before nodding. "Of course, ma'am," she said, stepping away and disappearing behind the curtain that separated first class from the cockpit. Back in economy, El Martinez continued her rounds, her clipboard tucked under her arm, her face set in that same unyielding expression. She didn't glance at Ethan again, didn't spare a thought for the boy she'd just silenced with a single, cutting sentence. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent years enforcing rules, someone who believed her word was law within these metal walls. To her, Ethan was just another passenger, one of dozens she'd dismissed over the years, a kid who didn't know his place. She adjusted an overhead bin, her movements precise, mechanical, as if nothing had happened. The cabin hummed along, passengers settling in, the boarding process winding down. But then the intercom crackled to life, its sharp tone cutting through the noise like a knife. "El Martinez, please report to the cockpit immediately." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. El Martinez froze mid-step, her hand still resting on the bin she'd just closed. The entire cabin went silent, a ripple of tension spreading through the rows. Heads turned, eyes widened. Mr. Bennett lowered his newspaper, raising an eyebrow as a faint smirk tugged at his lips. Ethan sat still, his breath catching in his chest. His heart thudded against his ribs. Something was happening, something big. El Martinez straightened, her posture stiffening as she adjusted the cuffs of her uniform, a nervous tic she couldn't quite hide. She'd been in this job for over a decade, walked these aisles like they were her kingdom, enforced rules with an iron grip. But a mid-flight summons to the cockpit? That wasn't routine. That wasn't good. She forced her face to stay neutral, her lips pressed into a tight line as she turned toward the front. Passengers watched her go, their stares a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment. Whispers followed in her wake. "What's going on? Did you hear what she said to that kid?" But she ignored them, her heels clicking with forced confidence as she disappeared behind the curtain. Inside the cockpit, the air was thick with tension. Captain Jonathan Reeves sat in his chair, his broad hands resting on the armrests, his weathered face unreadable. Beside him, the co-pilot fiddled with a dial, though his attention kept drifting toward the door. On the in-flight communication screen, a senior airline executive, Michael Donovan, stared back, his expression calm but his eyes sharp with intent. El Martinez stepped inside, her clipboard clutched like a shield. "Captain," she said, her voice steady but tinged with unease. Captain Reeves turned to face her, his gaze steady. "El Martinez," he said evenly, "we've received a complaint about your treatment of a passenger in economy. We'd like to hear your side of it." Her stomach twisted, but she forced a small, professional smile. "Captain, I was simply following procedure," she said, her words clipped and rehearsed. "A boy tried to change seats without authorization. I told him assigned seating must be followed, as per airline policy." Michael Donovan's voice cut through the screen, cool and precise. "Is that all that happened?" She hesitated, a faint shift in the air making her palms sweat. "Yes," she said carefully. "I instructed him to stay in his assigned seat, standard practice." Captain Reeves exhaled through his nose, a sound that carried more weight than words. "You told him security would be called if he didn't comply," he said slowly, his voice low but firm. "Is that correct?" El Martinez's throat tightened. She hadn't expected that detail to come up so fast. I only reminded him of standard procedures," she said, straightening her shoulders. "If a passenger refuses crew instructions—" "This was a 12-year-old child," Michael Donovan interrupted, his tone sharpening like a blade, "not an unruly adult disrupting safety protocols." Her lips parted, but no words came out. The cockpit felt smaller now, the walls closing in. Captain Reeves folded his arms, his eyes boring into her. "And do you know who that child is?" For the first time, a cold thread of unease snaked through her chest. I don't understand," she stammered. Michael Donovan leaned closer to the screen, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow felt louder than a shout. "His name is Ethan Clark. His mother, Victoria Clark, is seated in first class." He paused, letting the words sink in. "She also happens to be the CEO of Skyjet Airlines." El Martinez's breath hitched, her mind racing to catch up. Victoria Clark. The name was a legend, etched in company emails, splashed across headlines, a woman who'd turned Skyjet into a powerhouse. And she'd just threatened her son. A wave of realization crashed over her, cold and merciless. She'd humiliated the CEO's child over an empty seat. Captain Reeves let the silence stretch, his voice softer now, but no less cutting. You denied a perfectly available seat to a boy who asked politely, embarrassed him in front of passengers, and threatened him with security, all without even checking if there was a real issue with his ticket. Her stomach sank further, the weight of her mistake pressing down like a stone. Michael Donovan glanced at a document off-screen, his tone final. Mrs. Clark has requested immediate action. Here's what's going to happen. L. Martinez. You'll escort Ethan Clark to that window seat. You'll apologize to him in front of the passengers you shamed him before. And when this flight lands, you'll explain yourself to the executive board. Her face burned, but she nodded stiffly. Understood, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Good, Donovan said. Fix your mistake. The screen went dark. Captain Reeves gestured toward the door. You're dismissed. L. Martinez turned, her legs unsteady as she stepped back into the cabin. The weight of a dozen watching eyes followed her, but it wasn't the stares that broke her. It was the dawning truth that she'd lost control, and she had no idea what was coming next. Back in first class, Victoria took a slow sip of water, her eyes fixed on the cockpit door as it clicked shut behind L. Martinez. She didn't need to hear the conversation to know what was unfolding. She'd spent years mastering the art of justice, quiet, precise, unyielding. Somewhere out there, her son was waiting, his small heart bruised but unbroken. And somewhere in this plane, L. Martinez was learning that power wasn't hers to wield so carelessly. Hey, friends, what do you think so far? Have you ever been treated unfairly just for asking for something small? Drop your stories in the comments. I'm reading everyone. And if this is hitting you in the feels, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. This is just part 1. Things are about to get even bigger. Stay tuned. The cockpit door clicked shut behind El Martinez with a sound that felt final, like the closing of a chapter she hadn't realized she was writing. Inside, the small space hummed with the steady drone of the plane's engines, a rhythm that usually grounded her, reminded her of her place in this airborne world. But today, that hum felt distant, drowned out by the pounding of her own heart. Captain Jonathan Reeves sat in his chair, his broad shoulders squared, his hands resting calmly on the armrests. His face was a mask of neutrality, but there was a flicker in his gray eyes, something that told her this wasn't just a routine chat. Beside him, the co-pilot, a younger man with a nervous habit of tapping his fingers, glanced her way before quickly looking back at the control panel. On the in-flight communication screen, Michael Donovan, Skyjet Airlines senior executive, stared back at her, his expression as unreadable as stone, his voice still echoing in her ears. Fix your mistake. L. Martinez stood there, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest, her knuckles whitening around the edges. She'd been a flight attendant for 13 years. 13 years of walking these aisles, enforcing rules, keeping order. She'd dealt with drunk passengers, screaming babies, entitled businessmen who thought they owned the plane. She'd handled it all with a cool head and a firm hand, priding herself on never bending, never breaking. But now, standing here, under the weight of Captain Reeves' gaze and Donovan's words, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not the kind that came with turbulence or an emergency landing, but a deeper, quieter fear. The kind that crept in when you realized you'd misstepped so badly there might be no way back. Captain Reeves cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Let's go over this again, Martinez, he said, his voice low and deliberate. You denied a seat change to a 12-year-old boy, threatened him with security, and now we've got a complaint that's gone straight to the top. What happened? His tone wasn't accusatory, not yet, but it carried an edge that made her stomach twist. She straightened, forcing her voice to stay steady. Captain, it was standard procedure, she said, the words rehearsed, automatic. The boy, Ethan Clark, asked to move to a window seat that wasn't assigned to him. I told him to stay where he was. Assigned seating is policy. I was just doing my job. Michael Donovan's voice crackled through the screen, sharp and cold. Your job, he repeated, leaning closer to the camera, is to ensure passenger safety and comfort, not to intimidate a child over an empty seat. Her breath hitched, but she pressed on, clinging to the rules that had always been her armor. If passengers start moving around without authorization, it disrupts the manifest. Donovan cut her off, his tone slicing through her defense. Did you check the manifest? She faltered, her mouth opening, then closing. Did you verify his ticket, confirm the seating chart, or even ask why he wanted to move? Donovan pressed, his eyes narrowing. El Martinez swallowed hard. The truth sat heavy on her tongue, but she couldn't say it. Not yet. I assumed it wasn't necessary, she admitted, her voice quieter now. He was just a kid, I thought. Captain Reeves raised a hand, stopping her. You thought, he said, his words slow and heavy. You didn't know, you didn't check, and then you escalated it to security threats, over a window seat. His gaze bore into her, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of her mistake. Not just the act, but the way it looked, the way it felt to everyone watching. I didn't mean to escalate, she said, her voice trembling slightly, despite her efforts to keep it firm. I just wanted him to follow the rules. Donovan's lips pressed into a thin line, his silence more damning than any words. Finally he spoke, his voice low and measured. That boy's mother is Victoria Clark, the CEO of this airline. Did you know that when you threatened him? Her heart stopped, then thudded painfully against her ribs. She shook her head, a small, helpless motion. No, sir, I didn't. The cockpit fell silent again, the hum of the engines filling the void. Captain Reeves leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his jaw. You didn't know, he said, almost to himself, but you didn't ask either. You saw a kid, alone, in economy, and you decided he didn't deserve that seat. You made a call without the facts. Her face burned, shame creeping up her neck like a tide she couldn't stop. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to say she'd been strict but fair. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down, she knew he was right. She looked at Ethan Clark, his hoodie, his sneakers, his quiet demeanor, and judged him before he'd even finished his sentence. Donovan's voice broke through her thoughts. Mrs. Clark has made it clear she wants this handled now. You're going back out there. You'll take Ethan to that window seat, and you'll apologize. Publicly, in front of the passengers you embarrassed him before. When we land, you'll face the executive board. Understood? Her throat tightened, but she nodded. Yes, sir. The screen went dark, and Captain Reeves gestured toward the door. Go, he said simply. She turned, her legs unsteady, and stepped back into the cabin. The moment she emerged, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, charged with the weight of a dozen watching eyes. Passengers glanced up from their seats, some subtle, some blatant, their faces a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment. Whispers rippled through the rows. What's going on? Did you hear what she said to that kid? And El Martinez felt each one like a needle prick. She'd spent years commanding this space, her uniform a symbol of authority, her presence a signal that she was in charge. But now, every step felt heavier, every breath harder. She wasn't in control anymore. She'd made a mistake, a big one, and the cabin knew it. Ethan sat in his middle seat, his small frame hunched over, his phone resting on his lap. He wasn't looking at her, wasn't gloating or smirking. He just stared at the seat back in front of him, his fingers tracing the edge of his boarding pass, lost in his own quiet world. El Martinez stopped in front of him, her clipboard still clutched against her chest like a lifeline. She cleared her throat, forcing a tight professional smile. Mr. Clark, she said, her voice lower now, softer than it had been before. There's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you to the window seat you requested. Ethan blinked, tilting his head slightly. His dark eyes met hers, not with anger or triumph, but with a calm curiosity that made her stomach twist even more. She was different now, her tone, her posture, everything. It wasn't her choice. It was an order, one she couldn't ignore. He didn't move right away, just watched her, his silence louder than any words. Her hands twitched at her sides, betraying the nerves she tried so hard to hide. I apologize for any inconvenience, she added, the words stiff, rehearsed, but they hung in the air like a confession. A few passengers nearby exchanged glances. They'd heard the earlier exchange, her sharp no, her threat of security, and they knew this wasn't just about rules. She'd been harsh, dismissive, and now she was backtracking. Ethan shifted in his seat, his voice soft but steady. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his tone neutral, not accusing, just questioning. Elle Martinez's lips pressed together, her mind racing for the right words. "Yes," she said, hesitating. "There was an error in seating." "An error?" Ethan echoed, his voice still quiet, but the way he said it stretched the moment, made it linger. The cabin was silent now, every ear tuned to the exchange. He studied her for a long moment, then spoke again. "I had my ticket. You saw it, and you still told me to sit down." His words weren't loud, weren't angry. They were simple, honest, and they cut deeper than any shout could have. Elle Martinez swallowed, her throat dry. She wasn't used to this, being questioned, being held accountable, especially not by a 12-year-old. "I may have misjudged the situation," she admitted, the confession slipping out before she could stop it. "I'd like to correct it now." Ethan didn't move immediately. He pulled out his phone, tapped out a quick message, and set it back down. Up in first class, Victoria Clark's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen. "She's asking me to switch now." "What should I do?" Victoria's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, though her eyes remained sharp. She typed back, "Take your time, Ethan. Make her understand what she did." Ethan read the message, then looked up at Elle Martinez. "I'll go," he said calmly, "but I want to know why you thought I couldn't sit there." The question hit her like a punch to the gut. Passengers were openly listening now, some leaning forward, others pretending to read but hanging on every word. Elle Martinez's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. Not from him, not from anyone. She hesitated, her voice faltering. It was just... She couldn't finish because the truth was too raw, too ugly. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket," he said, his voice still quiet, controlled. "Just me." The weight of his words settled over the cabin like a storm cloud. Elle Martinez felt her chest tighten, her carefully constructed armor cracking under the scrutiny of a boy she'd underestimated. She'd always been the one in charge, the one setting the rules, the one who never backed down. But now she was exposed, vulnerable, and she had no answer that didn't make her smaller. Ethan stood, picking up his backpack, but before he moved past her, he said one last thing. "If you're going to apologize, at least tell the truth." And with that, he walked to the window seat, leaving her standing there, rooted to the spot, feeling smaller than she ever had in her life. The cabin watched her, the silence deafening. Passengers who'd once ignored the scene now stared openly, some with discomfort, others with quiet satisfaction. She'd spent years making snap judgments, enforcing rules without question, controlling this space with an iron grip. But now, for the first time, she didn't know what to do. Ethan settled into his new seat, his small hands resting on his backpack, his eyes fixed on the window. He didn't look back at her. He didn't need to. The conversation was over, and he'd won, not with anger or force, but with a quiet strength that left her reeling. Elle Martinez forced herself to move, her legs stiff as she walked briskly toward the galley at the front of the plane. The whispers followed her. She didn't care until she got caught. He was just a kid. What was the big deal? She looked so sure of herself before, not now. And she clenched her jaw, trying to block them out. The galley was a small, tucked-away space, a refuge from the passengers' eyes. But it wasn't empty. Mr. Darren, another flight attendant, with a decade of experience under his belt, leaned against the counter, stirring a cup of coffee. He'd seen the whole thing. The initial dismissal, the cockpit summons, the forced apology. And now he watched her with a knowing look that said more than words ever could. "That didn't go well, did it?" he said casually, his tone light but edged with something sharper. Elle Martinez shot him a glare, her nerves frayed. "I don't need your commentary right now, Darren." He smirked, taking a sip of his coffee. "Fair enough," he said, but he didn't stop. He leaned back, tapping a finger against the side of his cup. "You know, I've worked with you a long time. I've seen how you handle passengers. You're strict. Some might say too strict. She exhaled sharply through her nose, turning away. I follow the rules, she muttered. That's my job. Sure, Darren said, tilting his head. But today wasn't about rules, was it? She didn't answer, her silence a confession in itself. He pressed on, his voice lower now, more serious. Be honest with yourself, Leora. If that had been some businessman in a suit or a kid sitting with their parents in first class, would you have reacted the same way? Or did you see Ethan, alone, in economy, dressed like any other kid, and figure he didn't belong anywhere else? Her shoulders stiffened because she knew the answer, and so did he. Before she could respond, the in-flight phone buzzed sharply, cutting through the tension like a blade. She flinched, her pulse spiking. Darren sighed and reached for the receiver, pressing it to his ear. Yes? He listened for a moment, then turned to her, his expression unreadable. It's for you. Her heart sank. She took the phone with unsteady hands, pressing it to her ear. This is El Martinez, she said, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. A deep, measured voice answered on the other end. This is Victoria Clark. El Martinez's grip tightened, her breath catching. The CEO herself. There was a long pause, the silence stretching like a tightrope she couldn't cross. Then Victoria spoke again, her tone calm but laced with steel. I'd like to have a word with you before this flight lands. El Martinez's throat went dry, her mind racing. Understood, she managed to say, the word barely audible. The line went dead. She set the receiver down slowly, her hands trembling, and Darren raised an eyebrow. That bad? He asked. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her mistake wasn't just a mid-flight issue anymore. It was personal, and it was about to get much, much bigger. The galley felt suffocating now, the walls too close, the air too thin. El Martinez stood there, her breath shallow, her hands still resting on the phone. She'd faced tough situations before. Angry passengers, last-minute delays, even a medical emergency at 30,000 feet. But this was different. This wasn't a problem she could solve with a clipboard and a firm tone. This was a reckoning. She turned, forcing her shoulders back, trying to reclaim the authority she'd lost. But it felt hollow. Darren watched her, waiting, but she said nothing. Instead, she stepped past him, her movements deliberate, and headed toward first class. Each step felt like a march to her own judgment, a confrontation she wasn't ready for, but couldn't avoid. As she entered first class, the difference was immediate. The plush seats, the quiet hum of privilege, the faint clink of glassware. And there, by the window, sat Victoria Clark. She was striking. Dark hair tied back neatly, dressed in simple but elegant travel wear, her posture relaxed, yet commanding. She didn't look up right away, her eyes fixed on her phone, but there was something about her presence that sent a chill down El Martinez's spine. This wasn't just a passenger. This was a woman who'd built an empire, who made decisions that shaped thousands of lives. And right now, she held El Martinez's fate in her hands. El Martinez stopped beside her seat, forcing a professional smile that felt more like a grimace. Mrs. Clark, she said smoothly, you requested to speak with me? Victoria turned her head slowly, her dark eyes locking onto El Martinez's, with an intensity that made her want to shrink back. Sit, Victoria said simply, her voice low and controlled. El Martinez hesitated. Ma'am, I wasn't asking. Victoria interrupted, her tone unchanged, but firm enough to silence any protest. El Martinez sat, folding her hands in her lap, trying to steady herself against the storm she knew was coming. Victoria set her phone down on the table, her fingers tapping lightly against it before she spoke. Let's go over what happened, she said, her voice calm but piercing. You denied my son a simple seat change. You spoke to him with an authority that wasn't warranted, and when he questioned you, you doubled down instead of admitting you were wrong. Is that correct? El Martinez opened her mouth, but Victoria's gaze held her in place, pinning her like a specimen under glass. I want the truth, Victoria continued, not excuses, not protocol, the truth. El Martinez swallowed hard, her mind racing for a way out, but there was none. I misjudged the situation, she said, finally, the words tasting bitter as they left her lips. Victoria didn't blink. And why do you think that is? She asked, her tone still even, still unshaken. El Martinez hesitated, the truth clawing at her throat. Because he didn't look like he belonged. Because I assumed he was just some kid who didn't matter. Because I didn't even bother to check his ticket. She couldn't say it, not out loud, not yet. I was following seating policy, she said instead, clinging to the lie like a lifeline. Victoria leaned back slightly, tilting her head. Were you? She asked, her voice soft but cutting. El Martinez forced herself to hold eye contact, though it felt like she was sinking deeper with every second. If another child had asked, Victoria said, one sitting here in first class, dressed in a blazer, traveling with their parents, would you have reacted the same way? The question was a dagger, slicing through her defenses. El Martinez faltered, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. She couldn't answer because the truth was too clear, too damning. Victoria didn't push further. She didn't need to. She picked up her phone, tapped a few times, then turned the screen toward El Martinez. It was an internal email, her name bolded in the text. This is your formal notice, Victoria said, setting the phone back down. Effective immediately. You're under review for conduct. When this flight lands, you'll be escorted to a meeting with the executive board to explain yourself in detail. El Martinez's stomach dropped, her breath catching. Mrs. Clark, Victoria raised a hand, stopping her. You don't need to defend yourself to me, she said. You'll have your chance with the people who sign your paychecks. The finality of it hit her like a wave, knocking the air from her lungs. Is there anything you'd like to say before we land? Victoria asked, her tone almost gentle now, but no less commanding. El Martinez's lips parted, but no words came. For the first time in her career, she wasn't the one making the rules. She was the one answering for them. She sat there, hands clasped tightly in her lap, the hum of the plane fading into the background as the weight of the conversation pressed down on her. Victoria watched her, waiting, her expression unreadable. There were 1,000 things El Martinez wanted to say, excuses, justifications, pleas, but none of them mattered. She'd made a mistake, and it wasn't just about a seat. It was about something uglier, something she couldn't hide from anymore. I never meant to disrespect your son, she said, finally, her voice barely above a whisper, careful and strained. Victoria tilted her head slightly. Never meant to, she repeated, as if tasting the words. That's an interesting way to put it. El Martinez's palms dampened, her nerves fraying further. I only meant I was enforcing the rules, she said, but even she didn't believe it anymore. Victoria exhaled slowly, folding her hands on the table. Let's be clear, she said. This isn't about rules. This is about how you treated my son compared to every other passenger. You didn't question anyone else's seat, just his. El Martinez looked away, just for a moment, but there was no escape. She was trapped in this moment, in this truth. You judged him before you even checked his ticket, didn't you? Victoria asked, her voice still calm, still unshaken. El Martinez felt something twist deep in her gut. She wanted to deny it, to insist it was just procedure, but Victoria Clark wasn't someone you lied to, not when she already knew the answer. So she nodded, a small, reluctant motion, her eyes dropping to her lap. Victoria sighed, not in anger, not in triumph, just a quiet acknowledgement. Then you understand why this is happening, she said. El Martinez's mouth felt dry, her throat tight. She nodded again, unable to speak. Victoria picked up her phone, tapping out another message. When this flight lands, she said, you'll have a chance to explain yourself to the board. They'll decide if you keep your job. El Martinez's stomach lurched. Mrs. Clark, she said, her voice breaking slightly, I've worked for this airline for 13 years. Victoria set her phone down, her gaze steady. Then you should have known better, she said, the words landing like a quiet thunderclap. El Martinez opened her mouth, but Victoria turned slightly toward the window, signaling the conversation was over. She sat there for a moment longer, frozen, then stood slowly, her legs unsteady. She had no choice but to walk away, leaving behind the most humiliating exchange of her career. As she moved back toward the galley, her steps felt heavy, each one a reminder of what she'd lost. Not just control, but the certainty she'd carried for years. Passengers watched her go, their eyes lingering, their whispers following. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was the one who'd been called out, the one who'd been forced to face her own flaws. Hey friends, what would you have done in El Martinez's shoes? Have you ever had to face a mistake you couldn't take back? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm reading every single one. This is part 2, and things are heating up. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share if you're feeling this story. Part 3 is coming. Stay with me. The hum of Horizon Air Flight. 725 filled the cabin as El Martinez retreated from first class, her heels clicking against the floor in a rhythm that felt more like a countdown than a stride. Her uniform, once a symbol of authority, now clung to her like a costume she didn't fit anymore. She kept her head high, her face a mask of professionalism, but inside, her chest was a storm, anger, shame, fear swirling together until she could barely breathe. Victoria Clark's words echoed in her mind, sharp and unrelenting. Then you should have known better. 13 years with Skyjet Airlines, 13 years of late nights, long flights, and unwavering discipline. And it all came down to this, a single moment, a single mistake, threatening to unravel everything she'd built. She slipped back into the galley, the small space a temporary shield from the passengers' stares. Mr. Darren was still there, leaning against the counter, his coffee cup now empty, but his knowing smirk still firmly in place. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her, his eyes tracing the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides. "Rough day, huh?" he said finally, his tone light but edged with something that made her want to snap. She didn't look at him, didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed a bottle of water from the cart, twisting the cap off with more force than necessary. The plastic crunched under her grip, and she took a long sip, hoping it would steady her. It didn't. Darren tilted his head, undeterred by her silence. "You know," he said, crossing his arms, "I've seen you handle a lot worse than this. Drunk guy in 14B last month, swinging punches over a spilled drink. You didn't even flinch. But this is you rattled." She shot him a glare, her voice low and tight. "I don't need your analysis, Darren." He raised his hands in mock surrender, but the smirk didn't fade. Fine, he said. "Just saying, it's not every day the CEO calls you out personally. That's next level." She turned away, her jaw clenching. He wasn't wrong, and that's what stung the most. The galley wasn't a refuge for long. The in-flight phone buzzed again, a sharp, insistent sound that made her flinch. Darren reached for it, but she waved him off, grabbing the receiver herself. "This is El Martinez," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. A clipped, professional voice answered on the other end. "Martinez, this is HR. We've been briefed on the situation. When you land, report directly to the executive lounge at Gate 17. Mrs. Clark and the board will be waiting." Her stomach dropped, a cold wave washing over her. "Understood," she said, though the word felt hollow. The line clicked off, and she set the receiver down slowly, her hands trembling slightly. Darren raised an eyebrow. "Board meeting already? That was fast." She didn't respond, just stared at the phone, her mind racing. 13 years. She'd started as a junior attendant, barely 22, hauling bags and serving coffee with a smile she'd had to fake through exhaustion. She'd climbed the ranks, earned her stripes, learned every rule in the book, and enforced them with a precision that made her untouchable. Or so she'd thought. Now, it was all slipping through her fingers. And for what? A kid in a window seat? No, it was more than that. It was the way she'd handled it, the way she'd judged him, the way she'd let her own assumptions blind her. And Victoria Clark had seen right through it. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to move. She couldn't stay in the galley forever. There was still a flight to manage, passengers to serve, a job to do. She stepped back into the cabin, her clipboard tucked under her arm, her posture rigid. The passengers didn't stare as openly now, but she felt their eyes anyway, lingering on her like a spotlight she couldn't escape. She moved through the aisle, checking seat belts, adjusting overhead bins, her movements mechanical, her mind elsewhere. Every so often, her gaze drifted toward economy, toward Ethan Clark. He sat by the window now, his small frame curled slightly toward the glass, his hoodie pulled up over his head. His backpack rested on the empty seat beside him, and his hands were folded in his lap, quiet and still. He wasn't gloating, wasn't reveling in her downfall. He was just there, watching the clouds drift by, lost in a world she'd tried to keep him from. Something twisted in her chest, a pang she couldn't name. Regret? Guilt? She pushed it down, focusing on her tasks, but it lingered, sharp and persistent. Back in first class, Victoria Clark sat with the same calm poise she'd carried since takeoff, her phone resting on the tray table, her dark eyes scanning a report from her team. She wasn't angry, not visibly. Anger was too messy, too uncontrolled, and Victoria had spent her life mastering control. She'd built Skyjet Airlines, from a struggling regional carrier into a national name, fought off hostile takeovers, navigated labor disputes, all while raising Ethan alone after her husband passed 6 years ago. She'd faced bigger battles than this, but this one felt personal, not because it was her airline, but because it was her son. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen, a new message from Ethan. She apologized, kind of. "I'm at the window now." "Thanks, Mom." A faint smile tugged at her lips, softening the steel in her expression. She typed back, "Good. Enjoy the view. I'll see you when we land." She set the phone down, leaning back in her seat, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. Miss Avery, the first-class attendant, approached with a fresh glass of water, her smile warm but cautious. "Anything else I can get you, Mrs. Clark?" she asked, her tone deferential. Victoria shook her head, her voice low. "No, thank you. Just keep an eye on economy for me." Miss Avery nodded, understanding the unspoken request. "Watch Ethan. Make sure he's okay." "Of course, ma'am," she said, stepping away. Victoria's gaze drifted toward the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane. She didn't need to see Ethan to know he was fine. He was resilient, like her, but she couldn't shake the image of him sitting alone, asking for something so small and being denied so harshly. It wasn't just about the seat, it was about the way El Martinez had dismissed him, the way she'd made him feel less than he was. Victoria knew that feeling too well, years ago as a young woman, pitching ideas to rooms full of men who'd smirked and looked past her. She'd vowed Ethan would never know that kind of dismissal, not if she could help it. The flight stretched on, the cabin settling into a quiet rhythm. Passengers dozed, read, scrolled through their phones. Mr. Bennett, the gray-suited businessman from economy, flipped through his newspaper, occasionally glancing toward Ethan with a faint nod of approval. He'd seen the whole thing, the initial refusal, the forced apology, and though he didn't know Victoria Clark was behind it, he'd sensed something shift. "Good for you, kid," he muttered under his breath, turning a page. The woman next to Ethan's old seat, the one with the paperback, had put her book down, her attention drifting toward the window where Ethan now sat. She hadn't said anything during the exchange, but now, watching him, she felt a flicker of something. Sympathy, maybe, or admiration. El Martinez kept moving, her clipboard a shield, her tasks a distraction. But every time she passed Ethan's row, her steps slowed, her eyes lingering on him for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. She didn't want to admit it, not to herself, not to anyone, but his words had stuck with her. If you're going to apologize, at least tell the truth. He'd seen through her, stripped away the excuses, left her bare. She'd spent years enforcing rules, maintaining order, believing it made her strong. But what if it had made her blind instead? What if she'd missed the point of this job? Not just safety, but humanity. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, a sudden jolt that rattled the cabin. Passengers gasped, gripping their armrests, and El Martinez snapped back into action, her voice cutting through the noise. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened," she announced, her tone firm but steady. The turbulence passed quickly, the plane leveling out, and the cabin relaxed. But her heart didn't slow. It kept pounding. A reminder of the bigger turbulence, waiting when they landed. She glanced toward the cockpit door, knowing Captain Reeves was up there, probably already drafting his report. She'd worked with him for years, respected him, trusted him. What would he say about this? What would he write? She moved toward the back of the plane, checking on passengers, offering water, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. A woman in a floral blouse, Mrs. Henderson, a regular flyer, caught her arm as she passed. "You all right, dear?" she asked, her voice soft but genuine. Elle Martinez blinked, caught off guard. "I'm fine, thank you," she said automatically, pulling her arm back gently. Mrs. Henderson tilted her head, her gray curls bouncing slightly. "Didn't look fine earlier," she said, her tone kind but pointed. "That little boy, he didn't deserve that." Elle Martinez's smile faltered, her throat tightening. "It was a misunderstanding," she said, the lie tasting sour now. Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly, unconvinced. "Well, misunderstandings happen," she said. "Just hope it's not one that costs you." The words hit harder than they should have, and Elle Martinez moved on quickly, her pulse racing. She didn't want pity, not from Mrs. Henderson, not from anyone. But the older woman's comment burrowed under her skin. Costs you. She'd never thought of her job as something she could lose. Not really. It was her identity, her anchor, the thing that defined her. But now, with the board waiting, with Victoria Clark's judgment hanging over her, it felt fragile, like a thread stretched too thin. The intercom crackled again, Captain Reeves' voice filling the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Denver International. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are up. We'll be on the ground in about 20 minutes. The announcement was routine, but to Elle Martinez it was a ticking clock. 20 minutes until she faced the consequences. She moved through the cabin, checking compliance, her movements brisk, her mind elsewhere. Passengers complied without fuss, the flight winding down, but her tension only grew. Ethan felt the descent too, the subtle shift as the plane tilted downward. He pressed his forehead against the window, watching the clouds part to reveal the sprawling patchwork of land below. Fields, highways, the faint shimmer of Denver's skyline in the distance. It was beautiful, the way he'd always imagined it. And for a moment, he forgot the earlier sting of Elle Martinez's words. His phone buzzed in his pocket and he pulled it out, a message from his mom. "Almost there. You okay?" He smiled faintly, typing back, "Yeah, the window's awesome." He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the crumpled boarding pass. He didn't hate Elle Martinez, not really. He just didn't understand why she'd been so mean, why she'd cared so much about something so small. In first class, Victoria felt the descent too, her fingers pausing over her phone. She glanced toward the curtain again, imagining Ethan at his window, his small face lit up by the view. She'd fought for that moment, not just the seat, but what it meant. She'd spent years shielding him from the world's sharper edges, teaching him to stand up, to ask for what he deserved, and today he had. A swell of pride mixed with the steel in her chest, and she tapped out a quick email to her assistant. "Prep the boardroom at gate 17. I want this handled today." She hit send, her resolve unshaken. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability, about making sure no one else's child felt the way Ethan had. The plane touched down with a jolt, tires screeching against the tarmac, and the cabin erupted into the usual flurry, passengers unbuckling, stretching, gathering their things. Elle Martinez stood by the galley, her clipboard abandoned now, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She watched as the plane taxied to the gate, the jet bridge aligning with the door. Her heart pounded, each beat a reminder of what waited outside. Captain Reeves emerged from the cockpit, his cap tucked under his arm, his face unreadable as he passed her. "Good luck, Martinez," he said quietly, and she couldn't tell if he meant it or if it was just something to say. The door opened, and passengers began to file out, their chatter filling the air. Ethan grabbed his backpack, slinging it over his shoulder as he stepped into the aisle. He glanced toward Elle Martinez, just for a moment, their eyes meeting across the cabin. There was no anger in his gaze, just a quiet steadiness that made her look away first. He moved toward the exit, disappearing into the jet bridge, and she felt a pang she couldn't name. Mr. Bennett followed, tipping his head slightly as he passed her. "Rough flight," he said, gruffly, but there was a hint of sympathy in it. Mrs. Henderson shuffled by next, her floral blouse bright against the gray seats. "Take care, dear," she said, patting El Martinez's arm. The kindness stung more than the judgment. Victoria was among the last to leave first class, her movements deliberate, her presence commanding, even in silence. She didn't look at El Martinez as she stepped into the aisle, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low but firm. "Yes, I'll be there in 5. Make sure they're ready." She walked past, her heels clicking with purpose, and El Martinez watched her go, knowing that was the woman who'd just turned her world upside down. The cabin emptied, leaving her alone with the hum of the engines winding down, the faint rustle of papers left behind. She took a deep breath, smoothing her uniform, trying to reclaim some semblance of control. Gate 17 wasn't far, just a short walk through the terminal, but it felt like miles, each step a march toward judgment. She stepped off the plane, the jet bridge cool and quiet, and made her way into the bustling terminal. Passengers streamed past, oblivious to her, their lives moving forward while hers hung in the balance. She spotted Ethan ahead, waiting by a coffee stand, his small figure dwarfed by the crowd. Victoria emerged from the flow of people, pulling him into a quick, tight hug. He smiled up at her, and she ruffled his hair, her expression softening in a way El Martinez hadn't seen on the plane. They turned toward Gate 17 together, Ethan's hand in hers, and El Martinez followed at a distance, her heart sinking with every step. The executive lounge loomed ahead, a glass-walled room tucked away from the main terminal, its doors guarded by a security officer who nodded at Victoria as she approached. El Martinez stopped outside, her breath shallow, her hands damp with sweat. She'd walked into countless briefings, faced countless supervisors, but this was different. This was the end of something, or the beginning of something else, and she wasn't sure which scared her more. Victoria glanced back just once, her dark eyes meeting El Martinez's through the glass. There was no triumph there, no malice, just a quiet, unyielding strength. Then she turned away, stepping inside with Ethan, the doors sliding shut behind them. El Martinez stood there, alone in the terminal, the weight of 13 years pressing down on her shoulders. The board was waiting, and so was her reckoning. "Hey, friends, what do you think happens next? Have you ever faced a moment where one mistake changed everything? Drop your stories in the comments. I'm reading everyone. This is part 3, and we're not done yet. Like, subscribe, and share if you're hooked. Part 4 is coming, and it's going to hit hard. Stay tuned." The glass doors of the executive lounge at Gate 17 slid shut behind Victoria, Clark, and Ethan with a soft hiss, sealing off the bustling terminal like a curtain dropping on a stage. Inside, the air was cool and sterile, a stark contrast to the chaotic hum of Denver International beyond. The room was sleek, polished wood paneling, plush chairs arranged around a long conference table, a wall of windows overlooking the tarmac where Horizon Air Flight 725 sat, its engines silent now, its story still unfolding. Victoria guided Ethan to a seat near the window, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as he dropped his backpack beside him. He looked up at her, his dark eyes bright with a mix of relief and curiosity. "What happens now, Mom?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. She smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Now, we make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," she said, her tone calm but laced with the steel that had carried her to the top of Skyjet Airlines. Ethan nodded, settling into the chair, his small hands folding in his lap. He didn't fully grasp the weight of what was coming. Not yet, but he trusted her, the way he always had. Victoria turned toward the table, her posture shifting subtly, the mother giving way to the CEO. She pulled out her phone, checking a message from her assistant. "Boards assembled. Martinez is en route." She set the device down, her fingers tapping once against the screen, then stilled. This wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about the company she'd built, the values she'd fought for, and the line she refused to let anyone cross. Outside, Los Martinez stood frozen in the terminal, her breath shallow, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The security officer by the lounge doors watched her with a neutral expression, his arms crossed, waiting for her to move. She smoothed her uniform for what felt like the 100th time, her hands damp with sweat, despite the cool air. 13 years. That's what it came down to. 13 years of service, of sacrifice, of proving herself in a job that demanded everything and forgave nothing. And now it all hung on this moment, on the other side of those glass doors. She took a step forward, then another, her heels clicking against the tile, each sound a hammer striking the last nails into a coffin she wasn't ready to lie in. The doors parted as she approached, and she stepped inside, the temperature dropping further, the silence heavier. The executive board sat around the table, 5 men and 3 women, their faces a mix of stern curiosity and quiet authority. Captain Jonathan Reeves was there too, standing near the window, his cap resting on the ledge beside him, his gray eyes fixed on her as she entered. At the head of the table sat Victoria Clark, her presence commanding the room without a word. Ethan sat beside her, his small frame a stark contrast to the power around him, his gaze drifting between the adults like he was piecing together a puzzle. El Martinez stopped just inside the threshold, her clipboard gone now, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mrs. Clark," she said, nodding stiffly, then added, "Board members," her voice steady but thinner than she'd intended. Victoria gestured to an empty chair across from her. "Sit," she said, her tone even, unreadable. El Martinez obeyed, lowering herself into the seat, her back rigid, her hands resting on the table to hide their trembling. The board members watched her, their expressions a gallery of judgment, some cold, some curious, 1 or 2 faintly sympathetic. Michael Donovan, the senior executive from the in-flight call, sat to Victoria's right, his sharp eyes locked on her, a notepad open in front of him. He tapped his pen once, then spoke, his voice cutting through the silence. "Ms. Martinez, we've reviewed the incident on Flight 725. We've heard from Captain Reeves, Mrs. Clark, and several passengers. Now, we'd like your account. Start from the beginning." Her throat tightened, but she nodded, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Yes, sir," she said, taking a breath. "It started during boarding. A passenger, Ethan Clark, approached me and asked to move to an empty window seat in economy. His assigned seat was a middle one and the window seat wasn't taken. I told him no, that he needed to stay in his assigned seat, per airline policy." She paused, her fingers twitching slightly. "He asked again, politely, and I reiterated that he couldn't move. I may have raised my voice. I told him I'd call security if he didn't comply." A murmur rippled through the board, faint but noticeable. Donovan's pen scratched against his notepad, his face unreadable. "And why did you escalate to that point?" he asked, his tone measured but probing. El Martinez hesitated, her mind racing for an answer that didn't sound as hollow as it felt. I thought he was challenging my authority," she said finally, the words tasting bitter. "I've dealt with passengers who push boundaries before, and I assumed, wrongly, that this was the same. I wanted to maintain order." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained composed. "You assumed," she repeated, her voice soft but cutting. "Based on what?" El Martinez faltered, her breath catching. "Based on his insistence," she said, but it sounded weak, even to her. Victoria leaned forward, just enough to make the room feel smaller. "Or based on how he looked?" she asked, her tone steady but piercing. "A 12-year-old boy, traveling alone, in economy. Did you assume he didn't belong somewhere else?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp, and Els Martinez felt her defenses crumble. She wanted to argue, to cling to the rules, to insist it was just protocol. But Victoria's gaze stripped away the excuses, leaving only the truth. She swallowed hard, her voice dropping. "I may have misjudged him based on that, yes." The admission was quiet, reluctant, but it landed like a stone in the room. Captain Reeves shifted by the window, his jaw tightening, and a board member, an older woman with silver hair, scribbled something on her pad, her lips pursed. Donovan set his pen down, folding his hands. "Let's be clear," he said. "You denied a reasonable request, escalated unnecessarily, and embarrassed a passenger, a child, in front of others." And now, we learn that child is the son of our CEO. Did you know that at the time? El Martinez shook her head quickly. No, sir, I didn't. Donovan nodded, as if expecting that. But you didn't check his ticket either, did you? You didn't verify who he was or why he was asking. Her stomach twisted, shame creeping up her neck. No, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't. The board murmured again, louder this time, and she felt their eyes boring into her, weighing her every word. Captain Reeves stepped forward, his voice gruff but steady. I've worked with Martinez for years, he said, addressing the table. She's a good attendant, strict, but reliable. This was a mistake, no question, but it's not her usual. Victoria glanced at him, her expression unreadable, then back at El Martinez. A mistake, she echoed. One that could have been avoided, with a single question. Ethan shifted in his seat, his small voice breaking the tension. Why didn't you just ask me? He said, looking at El Martinez, his tone more curious than accusing. The room stilled, every eye turning to him, then back to her. She froze, her breath catching. His question was simple, innocent, but it cut deeper than anything the board could have asked. She faltered, her hands clenching in her lap. I should have, she said, finally, meeting his gaze for the first time. I'm sorry I didn't. Ethan nodded slightly, like he accepted it, but his eyes held hers a moment longer, searching for something she couldn't name. Victoria watched the exchange, her expression softening just a fraction, then turned to the board. This isn't about punishment, she said, her voice firm but calm. It's about accountability. Ms. Martinez made a choice that reflects poorly on this airline, on the values we stand for. I want to know what she's learned and what we can do to ensure this doesn't happen again. The silver-haired board member, Mrs. Langston, leaned forward, her voice crisp. Ms. Martinez, you've been with us 13 years. Your record's strong. Commendations. No major incidents until now. Why should we trust you after this? El Martinez took a shaky breath, forcing herself to sit straighter. Because I've never stopped trying to do my job well, she said, her voice steadier now. I made a mistake, a big one. I judged someone without knowing the facts, and I let my assumptions take over. I've spent years enforcing rules, thinking that's what mattered most. But today I see it's more than that. It's about people. I failed Ethan, and I failed Skyjet. If you give me a chance, I'll prove I can do better. The room fell silent, her words settling over the table, like a plea and a promise. Donovan exchanged a look with Mrs. Langston, then turned to Victoria. Mrs. Clark, your thoughts? Victoria's gaze drifted to Ethan, then back to El Martinez, her eyes sharp but not unkind. I believe in second chances, she said slowly, but they come with conditions. Ms. Martinez, I'm recommending a 3-month suspension, paid but with mandatory retraining on passenger interaction and bias awareness. After that, your performance will be reviewed. One more incident like this, and you're out. Agreed? El Martinez's breath caught, relief and dread tangling in her chest. Suspension wasn't termination. It was a lifeline, a chance to keep her job, her life. Yes, ma'am, she said, nodding quickly. Thank you. Victoria held her gaze a moment longer, then turned to the board. Any objections? The members murmured among themselves, heads shaking, pens scratching. Donovan spoke for them. No objections. Motion carries. He tapped his notepad once, finalizing it. Suspension effective immediately. Report to HR tomorrow for details. Captain Reeves stepped forward, picking up his cap. That's it then, he said, glancing at El Martinez. Use the time, Leora. Come back stronger. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The board began to rise, gathering their things, the meeting dissolving into quiet chatter. Victoria stood, smoothing her jacket, and turned to Ethan. Ready to go home? She asked, her voice softening. He grinned, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. Yeah. Can we get pizza? She laughed, a rare, warm sound, and ruffled his hair. Deal. Ellie Martinez stayed seated as the room emptied, her hands still clasped, her mind reeling. Suspension, retraining, a second chance. It wasn't what she'd expected, not the firing she'd feared, not the humiliation she'd braced for. It was something else, a mirror held up to her flaws, a chance to fix them. She watched Victoria and Ethan leave, their figures disappearing into the terminal. A mother and son unbroken by the day's storm. Captain Reeves lingered a moment longer, clapping her shoulder lightly. "You'll be all right," he said, then walked out, leaving her alone. The lounge was silent now, the hum of the airport muffled by the glass. Elle Martinez leaned back in her chair, her breath slowing, her hands unclenching. 13 years, and she'd nearly lost it all. Not to a disaster, not to a fight, but to her own pride. She thought of Ethan's question, "Why didn't you just ask me?" And it echoed in her mind, a lesson she couldn't unlearn. She'd spent so long seeing passengers as problems to solve, rules to enforce, that she'd forgotten they were people. People like her, with stories she didn't know. She'd judged him, dismissed him, and it had cost her. But it hadn't destroyed her. Not yet. She stood slowly, smoothing her uniform one last time, and stepped toward the door. The terminal stretched out before her, alive with movement. Families reuniting, travelers rushing to gates, lives intersecting in 1,000 small ways. She'd walked this path countless times, but today it felt different, heavier, humbler. Her job wasn't gone, but it wasn't the same either. She wasn't the same. 3 months stretched ahead. Time to reflect, to retrain, to rebuild. She didn't know if she'd come back stronger, like Reeves said, but she knew one thing. She'd never forget Ethan Clark, or the mother who'd fought for him. Across the terminal, Victoria and Ethan stepped into the parking garage, the cool air wrapping around them. Ethan climbed into the passenger seat of their SUV, buckling up as Victoria slid behind the wheel. "You didn't have to do all that, you know," he said, glancing at her. "I was okay." She started the engine, her hands steady on the wheel. "Maybe," she said, "but I wasn't." He tilted his head, curious. "Why?" She looked at him, her eyes softening. "Because you're my kid," she said simply. "And no one gets to make you feel small, not on my watch." Ethan grinned, leaning back in his seat. "Thanks, Mom." She pulled out of the lot, the airport shrinking in the rearview mirror. The day fading into dusk. They'd won. Not just a seat, not just a fight, but something bigger, something that lingered in the quiet between them. Back at Gate 17, Elle Martinez stepped into the crowd, her future uncertain, but hers to reclaim. The story of Flight 725 was over, but its echoes would last. Lessons carved in turbulence, redemption forged in accountability. Hey, friends, that's the end. What hit you hardest about this story? Have you ever had to fight for a second chance, or give one to someone else? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm reading every single one. If this journey moved you, hit that like button, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Thanks for sticking with me through all 4 parts. Until next time, keep chasing your window seat.